All right, friends, good morning. Let's open up our Bibles to Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1, and if you do not own a Bible, we have a Bible on the back table right over there. And if you don't own one, it is our gift to you. Today we'll be in Job chapter 1. You can find Job in the table of contents in the Old Testament. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 1 Kings, 1 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. Okay, so it's basically right in the middle of everything. Okay, so it's Job chapter 1. If we have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Kensen. I serve as the pastor here at Bridgeport. Honored to be with all of you. Also, as well, too, at the end of our sermon today, we will be receiving communion. So we have these communion packets, once again, on the back table right behind our production booth. So anytime between now to the end of the sermon, make sure you find some time to grab a communion packet so we can receive it together as a church family. Now, before I get into the sermon, I want to take a moment just to say thank you in caring for the migrants at our local police district. Now, there's some pictures on the screen here. You've helped with food, with donations, with conversations, and even with a coffee station for one of you. It's taken time, effort, and money, and I just want to say how incredibly proud I am to see so many of you living out Christ's command to love our neighbors, in which we believe Jesus says to love any who are in need. So as a church, let's continue to stay prayerful, let's stay active in loving these migrants and to ask God to meet them in these very, very difficult circumstances. But once again, just so proud of all the hard work that you're doing around this. Now, today for our sermon series, we are continuing in Great Stories, which is a selection of Old Testament narratives and how it points us to the greatest story, the story of redemption, the story of Jesus. And for today, we're going to be looking at the life of Job and discussing the topic of suffering. Now, before I begin, I want to share a resource that can help deepen our understanding on this topic, and it's by Tim Keller called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. It is one of the best books that presents a biblical understanding of suffering and the hope that we can have in Jesus. Much of the insights from the sermon today have been influenced by this book. So with that, let me go ahead and read some of our verses and jump in, okay? So Job chapter 1, and let's start at verse 8, and I'll read to verse 22. So Job chapter 1, starting at verse 8. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he does on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabbatons fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Verse 17, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The Chaldeans formed three groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you." Verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In 2020, I suffered the loss of my grandmother from my mother's side. Now, my grandmother raised a very big family, 8 kids in total, and my mom was the oldest of the 8. And my grandmother, she ran a tight ship. When it was homework time in the house, it was absolutely quiet. When there was a bug to be killed, she was the name that was called. And when someone thought that someone broke into the house or into the garage, she would be the one out there with a butcher's knife, chasing after the bad guy. My grandmother was an OG, an original gangster. Now, in the final years of her life, she was suffering from dementia. And it progressed to a point where she couldn't take care of herself. She couldn't eat on her own. She couldn't go to the restroom on her own. She stopped recognizing her very own family. It was devastating to see such a strong woman become so weak. And my mom, being the oldest in the family, carried the greatest burden emotionally, financially, physically in caring for my grandmother. One night I took my mom out for dinner just to catch up and just to care for her. And as we're sitting there, I asked her how she was doing. And in tears, she shared just how difficult it was. The family drama, the doctor visits, the financial burden, and in a tone of absolute desperation, she cried out, "Why? Why?" When it comes to suffering, it's instinctive to ask, why? Why me? Why this? Why now? Why them? Why her? Why him, right? We ask why when we witness disasters, disease, death, discouragement. When we see injustice, when we see shootings, when we see racism, we ask why. When we're in chronic pain, when we're dealing with infertility, when we're dealing with cancer, it makes us question everything. It makes us question life. It makes us question God. This morning we're going to be looking at the story of Job, a story of immense suffering. In verses 1 and 5, we get some background on who Job is, and we didn't read these verses. But in verses 1 and 5, we learn a few things. In verse 1, it says that Job was blameless, upright, and feared God. In verse 2, it says that he had a big and beautiful family. In verses 3 and 4, he was wealthy and prosperous. And in verse 5, he worshiped God and was a good spiritual leader for his family. And to cap it all off, in verse 8, God says about Job that there is no one on earth like him. Job was blessed upon blessed upon blessed. But in one afternoon, everything changes. Messengers come running to Job and give him devastating news. Verse 15, the Sabaeans killed your servants. Verse 16, the fire from God fell down, most likely lightning, and burned all your sheep and servants. Verse 17, the Chaldeans took your camels and killed your servants. Verses 18 and 19, a great wind struck your house down and killed all your kids. In one afternoon, an upright and godly man lost everything. His wealth, his family, and in chapter 2, we will also see that he loses his health. He'll be covered with open sores, dripping with pus, and infested with worms. He goes from being the greatest man on earth to the most pitied man on earth. And throughout the letter of Job, it's a struggle to understand why. Why? Now, 2 quick things to see in our story. The first is this. The Bible is very realistic when it comes to human suffering. The Bible, Christianity, doesn't treat suffering as some sort of fairy tale or some illusion or tries to sugarcoat it. The Bible treats suffering as raw and significant and messy. It is filled with stories of real people facing disease, rape, weakness, murder, corrupt government, racism, famine, domestic violence, injustice, war, torture, betrayal, poverty, death. The Bible recognizes and engages our suffering in an honest and vulnerable way so that we would know how to walk through it. Secondly, the story of Job shows us that faith and suffering are not exclusive to one another. So often suffering is seen as evidence against believing in God. So for example, if God is so good and loving, why would he allow suffering? Maybe he's not powerful enough to stop it. Why would I want to believe in a God who is so incompetent or not powerful enough to do anything? Or maybe God is all powerful and he could do something, but he's distant, he's cold, he's malicious, so suffering continues. Why then would I want to believe in a God who's indifferent to me? If he doesn't care about me, why should I care about him? Suffering can be easily seen as a catalyst to pull us away from God. But what we will see here with the story of Job is that in his suffering, it didn't lead him away from God. It made his faith stronger in God. For Job, suffering was not evidence against God. Suffering was evidence for his need for God. So with that, here are the 3 insights to help us to understand suffering and to move us along. And here are the 3 points. The problem with suffering, a purpose for our suffering, and then finally, a presence in our suffering. So first, a problem with our suffering, Do you know what frustrates us the most about suffering? It reminds us that we are never in control. When you're sitting in the hospital bed, when your marriage falls apart, when someone you love is hurting or dies, when your illness keeps you from doing the things you love, it reminds you that you are small and dependent. Suffering exposes our delusion of control. In our verses, we see very quickly that Job had no control over his life. In verses 6 to 12, we have a conversation between God and Satan. And God is just so stinking proud of Job. But Satan, he is unimpressed. So God gives permission for Satan to test his faith. So Satan decides that the way that he's going to discredit Job is by bringing immense suffering to his life. And notice that throughout all of this, Job was never consulted. He was never given a vote in the matter. Satan dished out the pain, and Job had to take it. Now, what's happening here is actually a small picture of a much bigger picture of human suffering. It points us back to Genesis when God made the world, and when he did it, it was perfect in every way. No disease, no death, no natural disaster. But what went terribly wrong was that we turned away from God. That God tells Adam and Eve that you see all this around you, enjoy this, work this, have it flourish. But there's just one thing. This tree of the knowledge of good and evil, whatever you do, do not eat of its fruit. If you do, you will die. But Satan, which literally means accuser in Hebrew, he seeks to discredit all that God has done, just like what he's doing with Job. So he comes along the way, goes to Adam and Eve, and says, did God really say that? You're not going to die. Instead, if you eat of it, you're going to be just like God. So Satan casts doubt about who God is and who they are, and it's in that moment when Adam and Eve eat that fruit, the world begins to unravel. Brokenness, death, hardship, and suffering come into our lives. Suffering was not God's original design. If we obeyed, everything would have stayed perfect. But because we rebelled, God had to stay true to his word, and death came into the world. A curse fell over all of creation. And this curse of sin is something that we have no control over. The Bible says the wages of sin is death, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So when we say why, when we look at suffering and say, this isn't right, something is off, you are 100% correct. This was never God's original intent. But let me just say, even though it was not God's original design, God is still 100% in control. It's not as though sin came into the world and all of a sudden God's caught off guard, lounging on his lazy boy. No. Notice here, Satan doesn't get to do whatever he wants. Satan has to get permission from God. Now, this is important because we can think that there's this big cosmic battle between God and Satan. It's an epic tug of war match. The balance of humanity is on this really thin line here. No. Satan is no match for God. The only reason Satan exists is because God allows for it. To watch a fight between Satan and God will be one of the most boring pay-per-view fights you will ever see. It's like an ant trying to fight an elephant. It's an absolute joke. Satan has no power or influence over God. God is totally in charge. And this is good news for us. Because even though we have no control when suffering hits us, God is still sovereign over all. This is why when Job experiences immense suffering, he doesn't go to God to blame him. He goes to worship. Verse 21, and he said, Job, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Notice Job doesn't say, why have you taken these things away from me? They are mine. I earned them. I worked hard for them. These homes, these children, this money, these things were mine. How dare you take them away from me? No. Instead, Job says, all that I have is from you. Blessed be your name. It's this humble understanding of God's sovereignty and grace that allowed him to exalt God in his darkest moment. Because the power of God that governs all evil is the same power that governs over your life. This is the God who has total authority to turn every evil for good. This is our hope. This is our rest. This is why we can endure, because even though my life is out of control, I can entrust my life to the one who is in control of everything. Do you see? The greatest danger for us when we head into suffering is not our weakness. It is our delusion of being big and being strong. It's this false sense of control that keeps us away from God. Here's the second insight. A purpose for our suffering. In verse 8, God brags about Job. Look at my servant. He fears God. He hates evil. There is no one like him. But Satan counters by saying, of course Job's great. It's because you don't let anything bad happen to him. I bet if you let bad things happen to him, he will stop honoring you. In other words, Job doesn't love you, God, for you. He loves you because of what he can get from you. He loves the money. He loves the prosperity. He loves the health. He loves the status. You take that from Job, he will walk out on you. Now, let's give credit to Satan here because he hits it right on the head here. It's easy, isn't it, to love God when he gives you everything you want? But how about those hard times? Do you still love God when he is all you have? Satan brings suffering with the intention to prove the weakness of Job's faith, but God allows the suffering for a much different reason. It's to show off the strength of his faith. It's to show through suffering that God was his greatest treasure. In the same way, God allows suffering into our lives to have us trust and depend on God in ways that we can never, ever do on our own. There are countless people, some of you sitting right here today, who have come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior because of some of the hardest and most painful times in your life. The painful and hard times didn't push you away from God. Those were actually the moments that drew you to God, and you found God to be everything in your life. This is why Job could say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord, even though I have lost everything," because anything that would make him draw closer to God for Job was a blessing, even if it was painful. This suffering was not defeat for Job. It did not crush him. It did not destroy him. Instead, this suffering refined him, perfected him, made him stronger. Now, I know that we would all wish that we could just purchase godliness. That we can go on Amazon, pick out my fruit of the Spirit. Hopefully it'll be on Amazon Prime Day so we get a little bit cheaper. Punch in our credit card information, and 2 days later, here comes a fruit of the Spirit. We would love that. That would be great. But that's not how God works. When Christ says to carry our cross and follow Him, He invites us to suffer like Him so that we would become like Him. Now, I know that in the midst of suffering, it can be very hard to see anything good come out of it. But here's the thing. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. We have to remember that God's perspective is infinite and our perspective is finite. When God is doing one thing, He is also doing a million other things that we don't see. In our moment of suffering, it might seem that God is not loving or good or fair, but could it be possible that God's ways are higher than our ways? When I was just an infant, a baby, maybe like 7, 8 months old, I was given a really bad piece of small meat to chew on, and that piece of meat brought about a high fever. A fever so high that I could have died. So my parents drove me to a hospital in a frenzy, and the doctors immediately saw me and put me on a block of ice to get the fever down. And my mom was telling me that as soon as my back touched the ice, I started screaming and wailing. Now, even though I was too young to articulate words or put together sentences, my screaming was very clear. Ow, this hurts. If you love me, take me off of this ice. You are hurting me. But doctors and my parents left me on that ice. My mom said that it got to a point where I turned blue. I couldn't cry anymore because I was so cold. Now, as a parent, I can't imagine just how hard it was for my parents to see all of that transpire. Now, looking back at this moment, I could have responded, "Mom and Dad, you are not good for putting me on that block of ice. You're not loving. You don't care about me because you allowed that block of ice to hurt me. I don't know why you would ever say no to me when I want to come off." But I don't say that today. Do you know why? Because I have the maturity and perspective, especially as a parent today, to recognize just how much my parents loved me. I recognize how wise and good they were to me by putting me on that ice. In the same way, God's perspective and wisdom is infinite, and we have to trust that He is working all things for His glory and our good. This is one of the most encouraging things about the book of Job and throughout the Bible. Nothing Satan intends goes according to plan. Satan wanted to embarrass Job, but instead, Satan gets embarrassed. Satan wanted to bring discouragement to believers, but instead, we have a book in our Bible that has been given as encouragement to sufferers for thousands of years. We also see throughout the book of Acts, Satan trying to stomp out the church, but what happens is that his actions only cause the church to spread across the world. When you look to the cross, Jesus is beaten, mocked, tortured, killed in the worst human way possible. Satan rejoices. He thinks he's won, but we know the story. God takes the worst day in history and makes a bad Friday into a good Friday. Friends, do you know that God is doing the same thing through our struggles? that even though it's painful and devastating, even though it doesn't make sense, suffering in the hands of our God never, ever goes to waste. The God who will redeem the world is also the God who redeems our suffering. And here's the final point. God's presence in our suffering. Now, for 37 chapters in the book of Job, Job never gets an answer for his suffering. Then finally, in chapter 38, God shows up. Yes, finally answers. Nope. Instead, Job gets question after question after question from God. 64 questions to be exact. God says things to Job like this. Job, were you around when I shaped the earth? What were you doing when I put the stars in their place? Do you know where the storms came from? Can you predict them? God even asked Job in chapter 39, verse 1, do you know how a goat gives birth? That's just a really awkward question, right? Do you know why horses are so strong? Do you know how to govern the world? Question after question. And after all these questions, Job still never gets an answer for his suffering. In the final verses, we see God restoring everything to Job twofold. And this is the end of the story. That's it. Question after question, and then God brings everything back. Job never in his lifetime understands why God does what he does. So what's going on here? When God asks Job all these questions, he doesn't do it to beat him up or to embarrass him. God does it to remind Job just how big and great he is. In essence, God is telling Job in his suffering that what you need in your suffering is not answers. What you need is me. In the same way, this is what we need. Now, we might believe that what we need is the answer or having more information. And when we do that, we can heal. It'll make it easier to endure. Any of us who have seriously suffered knows that that is not true. When we experience devastating suffering, the last thing any of us want is someone preaching to you. God has a plan. It'll all work out. How many of you guys in your suffering, let go and let God, right? Now, even though theologically it's kind of okay, but in the moment of suffering, what we need is not more information. What we need is someone to tell us that they love us and that they're there with us. Because behind every question of why does evil exist? Why does a loving God allow suffering? Where was God? Behind all these questions is our pain. Our suffering is not an intellectual problem, it's a heart problem. Explanations cannot save us. Instead, suffering reminds us of how much we need God. John Zoll, a Christian author, said this. Let me show it to you. God's office is at the end of our rope. The good news of suffering is that it brings us to the end of ourselves. It brings us to a place of honesty, a place of desperation, a place of faith. We might not always know the why, but we can always know the who. That even though we might not know the immediate answer to why we suffer, we know the ultimate answer, and that's by looking to the cross. Because it's on the cross we see our God, Jesus Christ, wounded so that we would be eternally healed. It's on the cross God does his greatest work of salvation and redemption by bringing suffering to an end forever. Revelation chapter 21 says this. Let me show it to you. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Even though God did not cause suffering, he will bring an end to it. It's on the cross. He lets the one and only Son suffer so that we would know he is not distant from our pain. He understands our suffering. He understands our anguish. The cross is God's answer to our cries. Isaiah 53 says this, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds, we are healed. At the end of Job chapter 42, Job saw his God, and Job was satisfied. At this point, he was not yet restored. He was still in pain. He still lost everything. His body was betraying him, yet he was satisfied. As a matter of fact, he stops asking why or trying to control God, and instead we see that he repents. Job chapter 42 says this, I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. When he saw God, he stopped asking why and started trusting in the who. Job wanted answers. God gave him presence, and that presence was enough. Church, is Jesus enough for you? You know, C.S. Lewis, a Christian author and philosopher, said this when he reflected on his own pain and suffering. He said these words. Let me show it to you. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Suffering is not God's way of pushing us away. It's how he brings us to himself. Now, what are some 2 quick applications I can give? Let me just give you 2. First, if you are suffering, don't hide it. When it comes to suffering, the Bible never tells us to hide it, to ignore it, to minimize it. When suffering came to Job, he tore his clothes, shaved his head, he fell on the ground and cried. We also see in the book of Psalms, where almost half the book is dedicated to lamenting. Weeping is part of the inspired word of God. God welcomes us to be authentically emotional before him. He calls us to weep. He calls us to cry out to him. Do not suffer alone, but lean on to others. After this message, we'll have deacons to the side over here after our worship service here, and we will love to have the privilege to be able to pray with you. It would be our honor. Finally, learn from your suffering. Ask the Holy Spirit to show you what your suffering is revealing about what you love most. What is your suffering saying about what you really believe about God? Suffering is very, very expensive. Do not waste it. Spend the time to reflect and journal on it so God can make you more like Jesus. Let me close with this. Corrie ten Boom was part of a family of hiding Jews and resistance workers during the time of World War II. In February of 1944, their whole family was arrested and sent to a Nazi death camp. Her father died there. Her brother later died. The women she was grouped with were all executed, and the most devastating of losses was her sister, Betsy, dying. Corrie's suffering was immense. Later on, she was asked about her time in the death camp and her faith in God, and she said these words. Let me show it to you. No matter how deep our darkness, God is deeper still. May that be an encouragement to your heart that your God is with you in your suffering. Friends, if we can, let's go ahead and take out our communion packets.